Diane Keaton left us with a memorable image that, as Woody Allen wrote, was unlike anyone the planet has ever seen or may never see again. However, even those closest to her were mistaken. This legendary life seemed to turn tragic at its end. Why was that? Let's explore the life and sad ending of Diane Keaton now. To really understand why Diane Keaton's ending feels so heavy, we have to go back to the very beginning, long before the world knew her name. I spent some time looking into her early records, and it turns out her story started in a very different way than most people might think. She was born Diane Hall in early 1946, growing up in Los Angeles during an era that many of us remember with a bit of a sigh. It was a time of post-war optimism, but for a young girl like Diane, there was a quiet, underlying tension in the family home. Her father, Jack, was a real estate broker and an engineer, a man of facts and figures. But her mother, Dorothy, was the one who truly planted the seeds of both Diane's greatness and her private sorrow. I found a particularly moving detail about her mother that explains so much. Dorothy was a homemaker who once won a local beauty pageant as Mrs. Los Angeles. On the surface, it looked like a small victory, but Diane saw it as a tragedy. She watched her mother, a woman full of creative fire, spend her days making meals and tending to the house, while her dreams stayed locked in scrapbooks. Diane later called her mother her first hero, but also her first warning. She saw what happened when a woman's talent had no place to go. This was her first wound, the fear of being just a housewife, of being ordinary, of being forgotten. It is a feeling many women of our generation can relate to, isn't it? That struggle to find our own voice in a world that often expected us to stay in the background. When she finally decided to pursue acting, she had to change her last name to Keaton because there was already another Diane Hall. She chose her mother's maiden name as a tribute, a way to carry her mother's unrealized dreams into the spotlight with her. Believe it or not, her early days in New York were not filled with glamour. She was a young woman struggling with intense shyness and a nervous energy that she didn't know how to control. I was reading about her time in the original production of Hair on Broadway, and did you know she was one of the few actors who refused to take her clothes off for the famous nude scene? Even then, she had a boundary that no one could cross. She was guarded, even when she was trying to be seen. Then came the turning point that changed everything. In the early 70s, she met a young, quirky filmmaker named Woody Allen. This relationship was the satellite that launched her into a different stratosphere. They weren't just a couple. They were two people who spoke a secret language. Woody didn't try to change her nervous tics or her habit of wearing men's clothing. Instead, he put them in a movie called Annie Hall. For those of us who grew up watching that film, it's hard to imagine her any other way. She made it okay to be a little bit messy, a little bit loud, and a lot different. But here is where the information gathering gets interesting. While the world was falling in love with that vibrant woman on screen, Diane was fighting a battle behind the scenes that almost no one knew about. She later admitted that during those years of peak fame, she was suffering from a severe eating disorder. She described it as a giant hole that she couldn't fill. She would spend her days at the gym and her nights consuming thousands of calories only to get rid of them. It was a cycle of self-destruction that lasted for years, right at the moment when she was supposed to be the happiest woman in Hollywood. Actually, when we look back at her performances now, we can see a certain fragility in her eyes that we might have missed back then. She was working at a frantic pace, moving from The Godfather to Annie Hall to Reds, all while her internal world was crumbling. At our stage in life, we understand that you can have all the accolades in the world, but if your health is failing, none of it feels real. Diane was a master of the mask. She wore the oversized suits and the big hats not just as a fashion statement, but as a shield. She was hiding her body, hiding her struggles, and hiding the fact that she didn't feel like she deserved the success she had found. As she moved into the 1980s, her fame became a heavy coat she wasn't sure she wanted to wear anymore. She had become an icon, but the Mrs. Los Angeles shadow of her mother was always there, reminding her that fame is fleeting and that the only thing you can truly rely on is your own strength. She started to pull away from the traditional Hollywood machine, choosing roles that were more challenging and less about being the pretty lead. She was preparing herself for a life that didn't depend on the approval of men or the studio system. Do you remember those Sunday nights watching her on TV or the excitement of seeing her name on a movie poster? She felt like a friend, didn't she? Someone who was figuring it out just like we were. But the truth of the matter is, the very things that made her a star, her sensitivity and her unique perspective, were the things that made the upcoming downfall so much harder to bear. The foundation was built on sand, and as the years began to press on, the cracks were starting to show in ways the public wouldn't realize for a long, long time. When we look at Diane's life, we see that her career wasn't just built on talent, but on the people she chose to keep close. Actually, the way she managed her relationships tells us a lot about the isolation she faced at the very end. I was looking into her long history with the men in her life, and it is interesting to note that she never married any of them. For a woman born in the mid-40s, that was a very deliberate choice. She had these major figures orbiting her life, men like Woody Allen, Warren Beatty, and Al Pacino, but she always kept one foot out the door. Let's talk about Al Pacino for a moment. This was probably the most impactful relationship she ever had. They met on the set of The Godfather in 1971. Believe it or not, Diane said she had a crush on him before they even started filming. They were together on and off for nearly 20 years. At one point, she gave him an ultimatum: he had to commit or it was over. Well, Al didn't marry her. Surprisingly, even after they split, they stayed in each other's lives in a way that most ex-partners don't. But this pattern of being almost a wife, but never quite committing, created a specific kind of independence that turned into a lonely reality when her health started to fail years later. Do you remember those years in the late 70s and early 80s when it seemed like every movie featured a great Hollywood couple? We often looked at stars like Diane and Al and thought they had it all figured out. But at our stage in life, we understand that having a partner to grow old with is a very different thing than having a famous boyfriend in your 30s. Diane chose a different path. In her 50s, she decided to become a mother on her own. She adopted her daughter Dexter in 1996 and her son Duke in 2001. I found a record where she admitted that motherhood changed her more than any film role ever did. She said it was the first time she felt like she was truly needed for who she was, not for her image. But there was a turning point in her late 60s that I want to mention. It was a shift from the screen to her obsession with houses and architecture. She began buying old, neglected homes and flipping them. She wasn't just doing it for money, she was looking for something permanent. One project in particular stands out: the large house in Sullivan Canyon. She spent years on it, obsessed with the details of every brick. This was during a time when the movie roles were starting to dry up, or at least change into grandmother roles. For a woman who was once the leading lady of a generation, that transition is hard. We all know that as the years go by, our priorities change. For Diane, her priority became building a fortress. Now here is something many people missed. During this peak of her house-building era, Diane was also dealing with the physical reality of aging in a very public way. She was diagnosed with skin cancer multiple times. If you look at her photos from the last 15 years, you'll notice she started wearing gloves, high collars, and those famous hats even in the summer. People thought it was just a style, but I found that it was actually a protective measure. She was hiding the damage that years under the California sun and the stress of Hollywood had done to her skin. She was a woman who was literally covering herself up as the world continued to watch her. Surprisingly, she also became very vocal about her past struggles with bulimia during this period. She wrote a book about it, explaining how the disorder had ruined her teeth and caused long-term health issues. When we talk about her sad ending in 2025, we have to realize that her body had been through a lot of trauma decades earlier. Those things don't just go away. They stay in the system and make it harder to fight off infections like pneumonia when you are nearly 80. I also found some information about her finances during these years. While she was worth millions, the cost of maintaining and building these massive estates was enormous. Selling the house that Pinterest built for $29 million wasn't just a lifestyle choice. I noticed that she delisted the house only after her health became so critical that moving was no longer an option. It seems she spent her final years trying to settle her affairs, making sure her children were taken care of before she became too weak to manage the paperwork. Do you remember the quiet evenings in front of the television back in the 70s? That was the world Diane lived in, a world of constant motion and noise. But as she moved into the 2000s, the noise began to stop. She wasn't seen at the Oscars or the big parties anymore. She stayed in her brick house, often seen only by her daughter or the occasional neighbor while she walked her dog. The transition from being the center of the universe to a quiet resident of a canyon is a path many stars take, but for Diane, it felt like she was retreating into the very walls she had spent so much time building. The turning point wasn't one single event, but a series of quiet realizations. She realized the men in her life were gone or had moved on to their own families. She realized her body was no longer the reliable machine it once was. And she realized that the fame she had spent 50 years cultivating couldn't help her with the breathlessness she was starting to feel. It's a reminder for all of us that no matter how much money is in the bank, peace of mind and physical health are what really matter in the end. Diane was getting ready for her final exit, and she was doing it with the same privacy and control she had used to protect herself since she was a young girl named Diane Hall. To understand the sad ending of Diane Keaton, we have to look at the months leading up to October 11, 2025. I was gathering information on her final year, and the timeline shows a woman who was quietly preparing for an exit that the public didn't see coming. For decades, we saw her as the queen of quirky, but behind the scenes, her body was paying the price for a life lived under high pressure. Actually, the very things that defined her style, those high-collared shirts, the gloves, and the heavy hats, were less about fashion and more about a long-term battle with skin cancer. She had been diagnosed with basal cell carcinoma at just 21 years old, and later in life she had to undergo multiple surgeries for squamous cell carcinoma. Surprisingly, while the world thought she was just being an eccentric artist, Diane was dealing with the physical reality of a weakened immune system. At our stage in life, we understand that health issues from our youth have a way of catching up with us. The severe bulimia she struggled with in her 20s, where she would consume up to 20,000 calories a day before purging, had long-term effects on her heart and digestive system. By early 2025, those close to her noticed she was becoming very thin. One of her longtime friends, Carol Bayer-Sager, mentioned seeing her just weeks before she died and being struck by how much weight she had lost. Now, here is something interesting about her financial and domestic situation. In March 2025, Diane listed her famous Sullivan Canyon property, the house that Pinterest built, for $29 million. She had spent 8 years of her life and a significant portion of her wealth gutting and rebuilding this home. To put your forever home on the market after such a massive investment usually signals a major life change. I found that she even reduced the price to $27 million just a few weeks later. Some financial experts suggested she might have been looking for liquidity, perhaps to settle her estate or cover mounting medical costs that she wanted to keep private. But the most telling detail happened just 14 days before she passed away. On September 27, 2025, the house was suddenly and quietly delisted. It wasn't because it sold. It was because, as a source close to the family later revealed, Diane's health had declined very suddenly. The bacterial pneumonia that eventually took her life wasn't just a random illness. It hit a body that was already fragile. Do you remember how it feels when a sudden flu or a cold lingers longer than it used to? For Diane, it turned into a crisis in a matter of days. I was looking into the records of her final week, and it is a stark contrast to her loud Hollywood years. There were no public statements, no final interviews. She spent those days in Santa Monica surrounded only by her children, Dexter and Duke. Even her most famous friends, people she had known for 40 years like Woody Allen or Al Pacino, weren't fully aware of how bad it had become. It was a self-imposed isolation. She didn't want the image of the vibrant, hat-wearing icon to be replaced by the reality of a 79-year-old woman struggling to breathe. Actually, the official cause of death was primary bacterial pneumonia. For someone her age, this often leads to sepsis or respiratory failure very quickly. Paramedics were called to her home on a Saturday morning, and she passed away shortly after being transported to the hospital. There was no autopsy, as the death was considered natural, and she was cremated just 3 days later. The speed of it all, from delisting her home to her cremation, shows a family following a very specific private plan that Diane had likely laid out herself. It's a reminder for all of us that no matter how much we build or how many famous people we know, the end of the road is often a very quiet, very personal matter. Diane spent her life being watched, but she made sure that when the end came, she was the only one in control of the view. She left behind a nearly $30 million estate and a legendary career. But in those final hours, she was just Diane Hall again, a woman trying to find peace in the house she built with her mother's stories in mind. Looking back at the life of Diane Keaton, we see a woman who spent 50 years trying to prove she was more than just a girl from Los Angeles with a famous boyfriend. She built a career on being different, and she built a home to be her sanctuary. But in the end, she couldn't outrun the physical toll of a life lived at full speed. It is a quiet, sobering thought to realize that even someone as vibrant as Annie Hall had to face the same silent, lonely battles that many of us do as we get older. Her sad ending in October 2025 wasn't a failure of character, but a reminder of the fragility we all share. She chose to leave the stage on her own terms, without the noise of a Hollywood spectacle, surrounded only by the 2 children she fought so hard to raise. At our stage in life, we understand that true success isn't the applause or the awards, but the peace of a quiet room and the love of those closest to us. Diane Keaton was a true original, and while she is gone, the honesty she lived with remains. Rest in peace, Diane. You showed us how to be brave even when the world felt a little too big.